To give you a little more insight about me, this story occurred when I was 14 years old. I was at my friend Emily's house since back then I lived there for personal reasons. Anyway, it was about 1 a.m., and her parents were gone for the night at her grandmother's house. We were watching horror movies and vegging out on snacks, like we usually would every weekend night. After our movie, I got up to pee and let her know I'd be back. She nodded before opening up her laptop to message her boyfriend at the time. As I walked down her barely lit hallway and came across the bathroom, I heard Emily's voice call out to me to her back porch that was on the right side of the hallway, which immediately struck me as odd because I'd never seen her leave the room or even walk past me. And why would she be outside anyway? Her voice called to me again, so I couldn't help but walk out to the back porch. It took a lot to scare me, so I wasn't bothered by this. Turned out to be the biggest mistake ever. A red flag should have went off right then and there when her voice became silent as I stepped onto the porch. I called her name softly, but she did not reply. I called her name once more, but this time louder, and again. Silence. I stepped off the porch onto the grass, looking into her wooded backyard. A little angry now, because at the time, I figured she was trying to prank scare me, like she usually did. It was normal for her to do. But when I yelled her name again, a voice spoke. It wasn't hers. It was another woman's voice. Help me, please. For the love of God, please help me. I heard a woman scream. Now I was officially freaked out. There was no one around for miles besides her one neighbor that lives a little ways into the woods. I found myself not being able to move. Curiosity, maybe. But the bushes started rustling, and what looked like a dog stepped out. My first thought was it was her neighbor's dog that must have gotten out again, because it has happened before. But when this thing stood up on its hind legs, it was easily about 7 feet tall. That's when I really froze. What was I looking at? I asked myself. I've never met any human that's that tall in my entire life. When it started to stalk towards me, I eyed it carefully. It was walking kind of like a human, but wobbling like a baby taking its first steps. I found myself not being able to bolt out of there like I should have. I could not move. That is, until I heard the slider door being opened and the real Emily's voice speak. Lana, what are you doing out here? I looked around my whole house for you. As soon as she finished her sentence, I bolted as fast as I could, pulled my friend inside before shutting the door and locking it while closing the blinds. I did this to every room, even the basement, locking windows included. All the while, Emily yelling at me, asking me what was going on. I took her arm, raced her into her room before slamming her door behind us. When she finally realized how terrified I was, and just how badly I was shaking, only then did she ask me, "What's the matter? You look like you just seen a ghost. What happened?" I finally calmed down enough to begin to telling her what I had encountered. But before I got the chance to fully explain what happened, I heard extremely loud banging on my friend's window. This stunned us both, and we both shot up, at least 10 feet into the air. I whispered when I realized I forgot to shut her blinds. I didn't have the heart to turn around, but when Emily's face went pale, I didn't have a choice but to look behind me, and I really wish I had not. There was that thing, looking into our bedroom window. I can't even begin to explain what it looked like. All I can come up with is that its body was twisted, like somebody who had just been in a freakish car accident, and it had fur, lots of it. The eyes glowed much like a cat, and a high-pitched noise escaped that thing's throat, making us not only cover our ears, but we both screamed as hard as our lungs would let us. I threw my friend on the floor before zooming into her parents' room to get her dad's rifle. When I came back, the noise stopped, and this creature, was gone. Emily was rocking back and forth, holding her knees close to her in the fetal position, shaking, crying hysterically. She had seen its face as clearly as I did, and the antlers that it happened to have. To say we were absolutely terrified would be a massive understatement. The rest of the night, we had all the lights on in the house, and we stayed huddled together in the living room, with the rifle sitting right under my legs. Finally, after what seemed like decades, the sun finally rose, and her parents walked through the door. Almost instantaneously, her dad noticed our fear-stricken expressions and his gun under my legs. They sat down, keeping their soft demeanor, asking us what had happened. When I explained it, they shared worried glances before announcing that they were moving. We never asked why. We were just happy to get out of there. We moved that exact day to my family's vacation home in a very populated city with little to no trees. When my parents got home and we told them, they had the same reactions and told me I can never go out after dark alone and to stay away from all wooded areas. Of course, I never questioned it. To this day, I don't know if it was a skinwalker that some people believe in, or if it was an imposter. What do I know, though? All I do know is that it was not human, and definitely evil and supernatural. Even though I'm 36 years old, I'll never forget this horrifying experience. I was 12 or 13. I know for a fact I was in 7th grade, and I woke up one night to a banging on my window. A quick note, me and my parents, since I'm an only child, lived in a 1-story house in a small suburb outside of Denver, Colorado. When I woke up and looked outside, my blinds were closing my window, but there's a streetlight that comes in, so I can kind of see through my curtains at least the silhouette of the shape of a head, except it had very long pointed ears and appeared bald, and had very spindly fingers as it was pressing against my window, almost like it was trying to push my window open. I felt like my heart was going to beat out of my chest, and I wasn't sure if I should make a run for my door and go to my parents' room, or just grit my teeth and bear whatever this thing was about to do. But then suddenly, it ducked down, and I could almost hear it crouching, going to the other side of my house, to where my parents' bedroom is. Now I was in complete and total panic. I jumped up, ran out my room, ran to my parents' room, and told them somebody was outside our house. My dad jumped up, grabbed the baseball bat, and grabbed the phone to call 911. Well, the police showed up within 10 minutes. They did a thorough scan and didn't find anything. I kind of looked silly, but my parents believed me. I told them I saw somebody outside my window trying to break in. That's at least all they know. But I believe it was more than just a person. Maybe it was a person in a Halloween costume. Either way, it freaked me out. I don't know if this falls under paranormal or what it is I saw that day, but back when I was 7, 8, and 9, I used to live by this large apartment complex, which was bordered by a large amount of woods. Very often, because my parents would leave, I would go and play with the neighborhood kids in the apartment. There was probably about 4 or 5 of us. We would always usually play hide-and-go-seek in the woods, or just find other mischief to get involved in. Well, one particular summer day, I'll never forget. We were playing hide-and-go-seek, and I was in the process of hiding. when I remember feeling like somebody was looking over at me. I began scanning the area around me, just the trees, and I spotted what was looking at me. I thought it was a person at first, and then I looked a little bit closer. It was the face. It kind of looked like a goblin with very fierce eyes, some ugly creeping goblin golem looking like creature. Once it noticed I was looking at it, for a split second, it continued to stare intently, then ducked its head behind the tree. That's when I freaked out and ran back to my friends, telling them I'm done playing the game. Let's go back to the apartment. There's something creepy in the woods. They laughed at me and tried to convince me to keep playing, that there's nothing out here, and I'm just being a scaredy cat. I didn't budge. We eventually went back to the apartment complex and found a different game to play. I want to say I was probably closer to 8 than I was any other age here. As I got older, I saw the movie The Lord of the Rings, and in it, I believe the first movie, there's a scene where they go into a cavern or a mine. It's right before they fight that big fire demon, or the wizard guy does. And there's all those like goblins or orcs that come in and fight them while they're in the tomb. The face that I saw looked very much like those goblin orc faces, very ugly and very scary looking. I don't really remember how tall it was or how short it was. I definitely know it was about my eye level, so probably closer to 5 foot. I was a pretty tall kid, and it seemed to be about eye level with me. Other than that, I never saw any of its hands or other body parts. That was about the extent of my entire sighting. Back in 2004, when I was with my cousin, hunting on his property, we ended up shooting at something that definitely was not a deer, and it was not a bear. Whatever this thing was charged at us through the tree line, barreling like a giant gorilla. It didn't even look like a gorilla. It looked more like a giant dog, but very man-like, if that makes any sense. Like its body was very that of a human, but its face was very warthog-like, and it almost barreled at us like a bear or a dog. It was massive, huge thing. We shot at it several times as it came barreling towards us, and we ran. It jumped back into the trees, and then ran parallel with us through the woodline, for easily almost a mile as we traced our steps all the way back to the road. It stayed hot on our path through the entire game trail, all the way back to my cousin's truck. Even that morning when we had gotten there, my cousin and I had mentioned something was wrong. Something felt off in the air. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, and there was just a thickness in the air. I can't quite describe it. Like an eeriness. We ignored it, thinking our senses were just eerily heightened for some reason. This wasn't different than any other time we'd gone hunting together, so we brushed it off. And then this encounter happened, probably no more than 3 or 4 hours out on the field. We never did see any bucks that day. Actually, come to think of it, we never saw any wildlife, except for this thing, whatever it was. This gorilla warthog man thing. After that encounter, my cousin did not hunt the entirety of the rest of the season, and it had just begun, which is a pretty big deal. He's a huge hunter, but it spooked him pretty bad. God only knows what we saw. I don't know if this is exactly a weird creature sighting, but I'm sure you'll find it interesting. Between the ages of 6 and 10, I used to go stay with my grandmother on the weekends on my father's side. She passed away shortly before I turned 13, and I stopped going there around age 10 because we moved out of state, so contact with her became much more minimal, even though her and I were very close for those 4 years. She did a lot with me, and we did a lot on the weekends. I was never one kid to just sit and watch TV all day at my grandma's house. We were always doing activities, chores, playing in the garden together, helping her do stuff. You know, very good grandmother-grandson activity time. One time, it was nearing fall. I'll never forget this, because it scared me so badly, but I never saw it after this, so who knows. Anyway, I am lying in bed, getting ready to shut my eyes. I should also make note that her basement had been completely converted into a little bedroom for me. You go downstairs, and directly to the right is a bedroom. Very nicely put, very well decorated. It wasn't slummy or nasty at all. Very nice. Then, when you go out the door, directly facing you was the laundry room, and if you were instead to turn to your left, instead of going straight ahead of you to the laundry room, you'd go right up the stairs up into the kitchen. So naturally in my bedroom, you had one of those high up on the wall windows, kind of like you have on any basement. They're very small, rectangular. You can't see out them that great, but they do allow light to come in. It was probably anywhere between 8 and 10 p.m., and I was laying there in bed. I still had my lamp on, because I think I wasn't settled down quite yet. And I just got this feeling that someone was looking at me, so I naturally turned to look toward the window, and that's when I screamed out loud, because I saw this really hideous face pressed up against the glass of the window, staring at me. I can tell you one thing. I don't think it was a person, but I really don't know what it was. It was pale, had really sharp bony features, and very sunken in eyes. There was no glow to their eyes, like many of these creepypasta fake stories. They were kind of just black. Obviously, it wasn't like the paranormal, where they're just two sunken-in black holes with no eyes. I think its eyes were just dark. And like a lot of paranormal stories, it did not have a big gaping black hole for a mouth. It was closed, so I didn't see any teeth, but its lips were very sunken in, and I couldn't see if it had hair or not. But it had its face clearly pressed up against the glass, as if it had been observing me from some time. As soon as I saw it and began screaming, it very calmly pulled away from the glass and disappeared. I ran upstairs, told my grandmother, who was still getting ready for bed at this time, and had not yet laid down. She was a little alarmed, but assured me that I probably just fell asleep and had a nightmare. But I was pretty adamant about my point, and that saying there's somebody outside the house. She went and looked herself, not seeing anything. My grandma, surprisingly, wasn't afraid of much, so she didn't even bring a weapon with her. She just figured if there was somebody out there, she would call the police. So she scouted around the house for me. Didn't see anything, no traces of anybody. The neighborhood that she lived in was rather small, but not like we were out in the boonies at all. And it's not like we were in a thick suburban neighborhood full of houses. It was kind of an old retirement community. Everybody kept to themselves, and after about 6 p.m., it died down a lot, got really quiet. There weren't really any other kids to play with either. I do remember that. Anyway, after seeing that face, nothing else became of it, and it would be several more years I would stay at her house every other weekend, or every weekend, depending on the month, and I never did see it again. But sometimes, especially now as I'm writing this, I wonder if it did come back and watch me as I slept, or maybe I just didn't notice it. I still wonder what it could have been. This happened in Sweden. I was 11 at the time. Me and my family was camping in a trailer, standing in a forest, with a river behind a hill. One night, at around 10:30, I heard a sound, just behind the trailer in the distance, close to the small river right behind our trailer. I placed myself at the end of the bed to get a closer look at the direction from where I had heard this sound. That's when I saw it. It was large. Not large enough to be a bobcat, but neither was it large enough to be a wolf. It was strolling on all fours in a straight line by the hill and the foreside, and even when the distance was about 30 to 50 meters, it stopped and slowly turned its head. That's when I realized that it knew somehow that it had been spotted. We lock eyes, and I see a pair of yellow glowing round spots just staring at me. It lasted for a whole 5 minutes. Then, it just gets these spasms or something, and runs off into the forest. To this day, I have no idea what it was. But later on, I found out that we were camping in a place very close to a witch's burial ground. Apparently, an actual witch had been executed close to where we were camping. Before she was decapitated, she said this: "Where my head falls, there shall grow a large tree." And apparently, exactly where her head landed, a huge tree grew. Normally, I don't do this kind of thing. I work for a pretty small production company that shoots commercials, music videos, and this time, last year, before COVID-19, I was outside of LA scouting potential filming locations for a client when, believe me when I say this, I saw a coyote stand up on two legs and begin to walk toward me. Frightened, I got back in my vehicle and drove off to a different area entirely. If you don't know much about the geography of outside LA, it's pretty much desert. There's rattlesnakes, coyotes. These things are common, but what's not common is to see a coyote stand up on two legs, just like a person, and come towards you. Due to my profession, I don't really tell people openly about this. In fact, I think you're really the only person that I've ever written this in and sent it to, just for hopes. Growing up out here, you do sometimes hear stories about Native American magic and witches and stuff like that, but I never really gave it much thought. Always just thought they were nothing more than campfire stories. But after seeing what I did, well, maybe there's something to it. I'm not saying that's what it was. Sorry this email is so short, but it was just very strange, and I was wondering if you've ever heard or seen of anything like this happening. Before I even go into my story, I don't want to scare you away. The Gallatin National Forest is breathtaking, as well as much of the state of Montana is. It's one of my favorite states to hike, explore, just because it has so much to offer. While it doesn't necessarily have the beaches that the coasts do, it offers its own unique beauty. Anyway, I was hiking a very common trail. It's called the Middle Cottonwood Trailhead, and is beautiful, as much of the state of Montana is, offering a large variety of sights and sounds all around you. It was on this day that I saw a creature that I cannot identify. I saw it from a distance, jumping out of the trees and walking down a slope down the hill, then disappearing by going into the tree line. I was the only one around at the time, so there were no other witnesses with me. This happened at about 2 p.m., broad daylight, only a couple clouds in the sky, very clear weather. No really shadows or objects obstructing my field of view. The creature moved kind of like a large cat, but from what I could see, almost had the body kind of like that of a hyena. At least the back reminded me of it. Had very disproportionately long forearms and back legs, with large hands and claws at the end, and the head appeared to be rather large and round, with what seemed like a very flat face, almost like a person, except no nose or snout protruding from it. Due to the poor angle that I was at, and the way this unknown creature was facing me, I didn't get a good look at its face, or any much of the features of the head, but it did appear to have small ears at the top, and it did have a very long tail. If I had to summarize it, take a black panther and a hyena, fuse them into one, and give it the head of almost kind of a light bulb shape, but then shrink it down and make it black, with kind of tall ears at the top. The creature was dark in color. I wouldn't say exactly pitch black, because it appeared to be maybe more of a smoky color or dark brown, and just like a hyena, kind of had a trail of tuft of hair going down its back that was much more of a visible gray color, and a long tail, kind of like a feline, but more slender, kind of like a dog. Its movements were also equally strange, since it did not match the description of a large cat, nor did it match the description of a dog or any other sort of animal I've ever seen. It's actually hard for me to try and accurately portray its movements, because even though it kind of crouched, it acted more like an animal on the move, and not exactly as delicate or agile as a feline would be, and not as rough and careless as a canine. After it disappeared into the tree line, I sat there, waiting for it, hoping it would reemerge so I could get a better look. I even pulled out my phone and zoomed in to see if I could see anything. But after waiting there for about another minute, nothing happened. So I put my phone down and decided to sit down and look out into the small little valley. Nothing. Nothing came of it. It never reemerged. About 20 minutes goes by, and a couple of hikers walk by. I asked them a couple questions, seeing if they've seen any strange animals they've ever seen before. They both gave me puzzled looks and said no. They went on their way. I was determined to find out what it was, but I found little to no hope of actually finding answers. The day went on, and my hike ended. After going back home, I even tried to do some research online as to what it could possibly be. I've seen everything from bears to mountain lions to big cats, but you don't understand. The description of what I saw, it doesn't match any of those things, and I got a pretty good look at it, since it took its time going down from the tree, going across the small hill to the other side of the tree line, never looking up at me, and it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I guess it could have been a chimera of sorts, a mixed hybrid of animals. That's what it appeared to be from a distance. I mean, if you think about it, when you see a cougar from a distance, it generally looks like a cougar. If you see a coyote, a wolf, or a bear from a distance, you can generally make it out to be exactly that. This thing was no more than 70 meters away from me, so it wasn't like it was obstructed or hard to see. It was just so strange that I'd never seen it before. I guess Montana is big enough to house a species of unknown animals if it really wanted to. Maybe that's what I saw. Maybe there are other people who visit that state and area that might be able to know. Perhaps I should try reaching out to more people in that area, maybe finding out more. I tried talking to more people, like the park rangers and stuff, but they had no idea what I was talking about. I'd even tried talking to more hikers who frequented that area. You'd be surprised by how many of the same people you see walking some of the same trailheads that just enjoy the scenic view. Same thing. So there's no way I can be the only one to have seen this thing. Maybe there's more of us. Hello again, what lurks beneath. This is the Facebook werewolf guy here, with another true experience, as promised. Last story was mostly supernatural, about Ouija boards, but I know your channel is cryptid focused, so I decided to wait on another account that I've had, and give a short but quick real experience with the cryptid sighting that I had this past summer of 2019. I watch a channel that is fairly focused regularly, and she had done a video at the time that mentioned fairy cats, which conjured up some fair memories. I commented, and this is this. Well, this time wasn't as weird as the last two times, where I had not thought about your channel, until right up to the day where you uploaded new material. But I must admit this time, I thought about your channel a few times over the last week, and I thought this would help. I live out near the woods in Central Florida, and I decided to take care of some stray cats who were hanging out near my home. A male and a female. They eventually had kittens. All seemed well. I tried to keep the female in the house, but my poodle kept trying to mate with her, and it obviously didn't work out. Then, strangely, one by one, over a couple of weeks, they began to disappear. I didn't understand what was going on. I never heard any commotion or anything outside at night. I eventually spoke to a neighbor who also strangely has two poodles, and she said she stopped letting them out at night because one night she saw a dark shadow, the size of a mid-sized dog, chasing after them, but it stopped at the edge of the woods. Then, another neighbor said that she saw a shadow near the woods, trying to take her cat one evening and stop letting her out entirely. I tried 3 shelters to save the remaining cats, but none would take them. I took them back home, and still, every morning, I'd find another missing, and because they were wild caging didn't work. They destroyed the cage, knocked the litter all over the place, and would cry all night when I did that. So I let them out. In a few days, they were all gone. I'm heartbroken over it, but what could I do? I couldn't take them for a ride. No one might have picked them up, and they still could have died. It's just so strange I never heard a sound. Not a fight or a scream or squealing or anything. Just disappearing one by one. Seeing your video about fairy cats brought back memories. Good ones, of course. Raisin, the mom, looked like the Meow Mix cat. Her mate, I called Tabby, was a tabby cat. The little black one, I called Coley. The 2 gray twins, I called the 2 Diddies. The little Ray got her name because she looked like the mom and Tabs Jr. looked like the dad. I love them, and they're just gone. Drives me nuts not knowing exactly what happened. No sound, no noise, nothing. Creepy, and sad to say the least. Okay, so that was my first comment on her video. Not too long after, so many weeks later or so, I commented again, letting her know that I saw the culprit that did it. Well, finally discovered what killed my cats, and no telling what else. I'm drunk and upset, but it's the truth. I saw a canine-type chupacabra run across the front lawn at dusk. Leather gray skin and a puff of white hair on the tip of its tail. It was not normal. Though the size of a shepherd, it was thin, gangly, and strange. A kind of long torso and hunched back. I saw it out my window for 2 seconds. An hour later, I went on at night with a flashlight to investigate. I found a fat rabbit in the very small man-made pond in the front yard. I used a rake to help it escape drowning, since it could not get out. It probably jumped in to escape that monster. I'm positive that's what took my cats. I love those cats and kittens. Nature sucks and blows. Where are the protective fairy spirits of the forest to defend the innocent lives of animals? My question is cynical, as well as rhetorical. So that's my story. Quick and to the point. Nasty, upsetting story, but true. Again, appreciate you reading my stories to you and your audience. Be careful, stay safe, and to quote another favorite channel of mine, this world is a strange one. I spent the vast majority of my teenage life living with my grandfather and aunt. They owned a few dogs, a couple cats, and 2 horses. I distinctly remember my grandfather one night shooting at something that he believed was a chupacabra. Funny thing is, this was in the late 90s. I had never even heard of a chupacabra before. Not until the early 2000s, when it kind of became popularized on TV. Shows like Sci-Fi and Discovery Channel, where they would have those cryptid shows that talk about Bigfoot. Then, they began talking about a small dog-like creature, or at least what they thought was, that was draining the blood out of animals. While some thought this to be the work of alien abduction, my grandfather got a good look at the creature that was responsible. Going out one morning to take care of his 2 prized horses, one was found dead in its stall. 2 large puncture holes found in its neck. What was alarming was that the puncture holes in its neck were 3/4 of an inch in diameter. That's huge, and they were 1.5 inches apart. No blood, nothing. It was as if the blood had just completely drained out of the horse. The horse also appeared to have been dead for several days, even though my grandfather had just tended his horses the night prior. I can remember that being a very hard loss for my grandfather. Since Grandma died, he became really attached to those 2 horses. spent a lot of time with them, riding them. He was definitely an animal lover, and losing that one horse, that was really rough. That same night, this thing came back on, which would I believe to claim the life of the other horse. He had his rifle ready, and when it came on, near the stall, he got a good look at it, and coming from someone like my grandfather, he was pretty scared. He said that the bullets appeared to go right through it, and that it appeared as if this creature had crawled right out of the pits of hell, or at least appeared to be that way, aesthetically. In fact, he kept making references of like a large cat, or even a saber-toothed cat, mentioning how it had large protruding canines coming from the front of its mouth that were oversized for its entire body, and was ultimately terrified by the sheer speed and force that this creature seemed to possess. He called it otherworldly, and said he has never in his entire 86 years of life seen anything remotely close to what he saw. It wasn't a wolf, and it wasn't no dog. This thing was larger, and was almost a smoky black color. He also talked about the horrendous smell of sulfur and rotting meat. I don't know if that has anything to do with the actual sightings of Chupacabra, but it was a very interesting note. I'm now 42, and my grandfather has long since passed away, but this encounter has always stuck out to me, because even though I didn't physically see it, my grandfather was very much shaken up, and our little farm, our little home, was attacked by one of these things. So, in a way, I like to say that we actually had a real-life encounter with these things. I'm not writing this into you with the claim to know anything about cryptids or anything that goes on in the world, but I can share my disturbing experiences, at least one. I had some pretty close friends who lived in the Navajo reservation. Believe me, I know they have their own sets of standards and rituals and lots of crazy weird things that happen on their own reservation. A lot of things I don't quite know about or understand. But I tried to ignore all that the best I could. And I spent time there often because my friends were, well, very hospitable and would always want me over, enjoying time with their family and other relatives. Because of this, we would spend time outside often, not during the nighttime of course, but during the day, exploring, going on hikes when we could. And I'll never forget one day where my friend and his family took me out to this really cool place that I'm not going to name because I feel like naming it would be leading people to go there, assuming you are going to read this. But this place is kind of higher up, and it's actually in Arizona, a little ways away from the reservation. We drove out because my friend and his family have family that live out there. Anyway, on this trail, about 3 p.m., we found at least 4 or 5 dead coyotes, all of them having their blood completely drained of their body. And even the way they had died, they had this terrible expression on their face, as if they died in terror, and they had huge gash marks on their neck. Not like a knife, but like something bit or torn to their neck. No other part of their body was ripped open, cut open, sliced. No damage, nothing. It's as if something had just tore their neck and left. The other strange thing was there was no blood anywhere around them, nor was the wound on their necks bloody at all. Their body also didn't appear to be decaying, which is very weird. As you know, any cadaver left under extreme heat conditions rots and decays pretty quickly, especially when there's humid conditions. But these had clearly been there for what appeared to be days, but also appeared to be fresh. Let me explain a little better. Fresh, as in there was no flies, like it was a fresh cadaver, but the corpses clearly looked a little bit old, like they were kind of mummified in a way. It was very strange, and I think it was because of the lack of any apparent body fluids. I had never seen anything quite like it. The marks on their neck, all at the same spot, the same size. Kind of looked like a mix between a gash and a tear. It's hard to really explain how it looked, but it was very strange, and it all creeped us out. In fact, after about a mile or so, we ended up turning back, because these corpses were littered almost all over the trail. This isn't a public nature preserve trail, just more of a little private area that their family frequents. This has always bothered me for a long time, mainly because I never know who to talk to get answers. But after watching a lot of your videos, I feel like you might have a pretty well-educated opinion and guess on what it is that I saw. When I was 12, me and a few friends ventured through a local graveyard, a rather large one, actually. I don't know, maybe 10 plus acres? It's a pretty large graveyard. Anyway, being 12 years old, we thought it was fun and very creepy. But the actual story takes place when we saw something towards the center of the cemetery. Like most cemeteries, it wasn't filled with spooky owls or dead trees or mist. It was your pretty stereotypical North American cemetery. Lots of graves, a black iron fence surrounding, and lots of very much alive trees. But on this night, around maybe 1 in the morning, it's obviously pitch black, tucked away from the road, and all we had was flashlights. All 3 of us, including me, saw this creature, which scurried away, very strangely. When we saw movement up ahead, we all shone our lights, and by the way, at this point, we're walking towards the center of the cemetery, where there is an incredibly large oak tree. We shine our lights because we think we saw movement, and sure enough, this large figure comes heading out to the right and leaps and jumps, but it was walking on all 4. We only saw it for a couple of seconds, and to give you the best description, it was a pale white-gray color, on all 4s, kind of like a hairless dog. But I can vividly and distinctly remember these long spikes or spines coming out of its back and back legs. The head was much more humanoid. It kind of looked a little bit dog-like, but very alien-like. Large black eyes, and it had these massive fangs coming out of its mouth. I'm not talking about just vampire fangs. I mean large fangs for every teeth, like there were too many teeth for its mouth. It didn't really look in our direction, but its mouth was open, and this thing was a pretty good-sized animal. It kind of hesitated for a second, jumped out of the oak tree, and then off it went into the night. It moved so fast that our flashlights could not keep up. It scared all of us, and so we left and ran away. We've always talked about it since, and I'm still really good friends with those 3 kids that I did that with. We bring it up casually, always wondering, what is it that we saw that night? While one of us speculates it was the rake, or a crawler, I'm not so sure that it fits the descriptions. Sounds like it could be something alien, or more than that. What's your opinion? This story begins the day after I moved into my new house. I had just moved from my apartment, which was in a bad neighborhood, with lots of bad things happening there. But that's a whole other story. So, I had just moved into my new house, a small 2-bedroom house. The kitchen was right in front of the master bedroom, and the secondary bedroom was right off the living room. I had my mother and 2 siblings living with me. They took the very large master, while I took the secondary bedroom. Anyway, this encounter took place pretty late in the night, right around 11 p.m. Everybody had gone to sleep, so I was pretty excited that I got the house all to myself. I decided that I would do the dishes to help out my mother, then play some games on my Xbox for the rest of the night. I walked into the kitchen with my dog and started doing up the dishes. About halfway through them, I started feeling really uneasy. I started thinking that it was just an unexpected anxiety attack, which I get pretty often, so I didn't really think much of it. I paused, decided that maybe a glass of water would help. While I was sipping my water, I started to hear my dog growling from the living room. I say my dog, but he really is my mother's dog. He is a very, very good guard dog, as in will destroy an intruder in a heartbeat type of guard dog. So I hear him growling, a very low growl, a quiet growl. Me being the stupid 17-year-old who I am, I decided I was going to go see what he was doing. I put down my glass, walked into the living room, where both my puppy and mother's dog were standing by the front door, their nose in the crack of it. I tiptoed up my way to the door, listening very carefully. All I heard was a faint scratching noise. I assumed it was just a raccoon, or one of the stray cats that frequented our house, because we would always leave food for them. I took a peek out the front window, which is located right beside the door. Well, I didn't see anything. Just the dark yard and porch illuminated softly by the glow of the streetlight in the very front of the house. I told the dogs to chill out before they woke up the entire family. After they settled down a bit, I went back to finish up the dishes and think about what games I was going to play. As I was washing a plate, I got that uneasy feeling again. The feeling in the pit of your stomach that just feels like something is very wrong. I tried brushing it off, but it was coming on so strong. All of a sudden, I got the feeling as though somebody was behind me, staring at me, silently watching me. My uneasy feeling turned into scared, then stress. I was so uneasy that I whispered to myself, "Something bad is going to happen. I just know it." The floor began rumbling as though someone was running on it, running up behind me as my back was turned away from the entry to the kitchen. It rumbled so hard. The pounding of the footsteps was so loud. I didn't know what to do except put my hands over my ears to block out sound. It ran up behind me, and it slammed me into the kitchen counter, leaving a large purple bruise on my stomach. As soon as it all started, it stopped. Nothing but silence in the small kitchen. While checking my stomach, I waited, just to see if anything else was going to happen. But nothing did. The room fell quiet. I began panicking, feeling so scared about what had just happened. I finally got the courage to turn around, and as I did, I sighed in relief. My big-eyed pupper was sitting in the doorway, staring up at me. I walked over to her and hugged her, then hooked her up to a leash to take her out before I went to bed. At this point, it was about 12 p.m., and I was so scared and exhausted from that experience, I just decided it was the sleep my body was desperately craving but had not received, causing me to think something happened when it really did not. Though it doesn't explain the bruise forming on my stomach, I said to my pup, hard to believe that my mind could conjure up something so scary. She was hooked up, and when we walked out on the porch, normally we have 4 baby stray cats that basically live out there, but they were nowhere in sight. I assumed they took cover at the neighbor's house. I walked little pupper into the yard, a little ways from the side of the house where the kitchen window was. Now, I wasn't in front of the kitchen window. I was at the front of the yard, but I could see the kitchen window from where I was standing. I looked down and talked to my pup, telling her what a good girl she is and how beautiful she looked. You know, what all puppy mamas do. She looked up at me and wagged her tail in delight. But then her mood suddenly changed as then her neck snapped to where the kitchen window was. When I say snapped, I mean she turned her head so fast, I for real thought she was going to break her neck. It startled me, so I naturally took a couple steps backwards, trying to calm down from the scare. I glanced over to where she was looking, just a small quick glance, and to my surprise, I actually saw something. I wasn't expecting to see anything, so I had a double take at the sight of this thing. We both sat and stared, trying to see what it was. It looked like a tall black silhouette, maybe 8 feet tall, with a very large chest. I remember the chest so well, because it stuck out so far, like scarily far. The figure looked thin in the face, but quite large in the rest of the body. It was staring over the large hedge that was in front of our kitchen window. It was staring into the window, like it was waiting, silently, for somebody or something to move inside the house. I'm guessing my dog's eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, because she let out a small woof at this creature. As soon as she did this, the creature turned his head and stared at me with huge green eyes. My heart sank. The way its eyes were reflecting the light made me instantly think that what I was standing in front of was a giant 7 to 8 foot tall animal. It was silent. No sound. No nothing. In fact, I was so focused on the creature that I had failed to realize that the night insects had gone silent. There was no noise, except for the static sound of the energy coming from the city. I froze, while my puppy began barking loudly and violently. What could this be? Am I seeing things? Is this real? I scooped my pup in my arms, ran in the house. All the while, the same pounding and hearing the loud thudding footsteps as the previous encounter that took place an hour earlier. I ran so fast that I nearly tripped over my own feet. I darted indoors, basically tossing my pooch on the couch, locking the door as fast as I could, leaning against the door, and I listened for whatever it was that chased us in. I also held the door closed, thinking it would actually do something to protect us from that thing. All I could hear was the sound of my heavy breaths from running. My dog's barking must have disturbed my family, because my mother came out of her room, saw me holding the door closed. She saw that I was distressed, wrapped her arms around me, telling me everything was okay, and asking what happened. I couldn't get the story out. For some reason, my mind told me not to tell her, because I knew that she would not believe me. So, I made up a story about how one of the neighbors startled me, and assured her that I was okay. To this day, she still does not know the story. None of my family does, and I still don't know what that creature was. But I do know one thing. It's going to haunt my mind for a very long time. The events I'm about to describe are very true, and I will take them to my grave. These events occurred around 2013 or 2014 midsummer in a small town in rural New Hampshire. Both stories also happened with one of my friend's friend being present at the time, and he witnessed the same things that I did. The first event that took place was on a warm summer night. My friend and I live in the same town, only about 2 miles from each other. At the time, I had my license and he did not, so I would drive out to his house, hang out, play video games, or I would pick him up and drive back to my place to hang out. Right down the hill from us and my place is this old textile mill that has been closed for a while. There have always been rumors going around about how people died working in the mill years ago. Sometimes at night, if you look in the window, apparently, you can still see ghostly figures, still dressed in old-time clothing. Across the street from the mill is a dirt parking lot that telephone companies would park their work trucks in and grab them in the morning. I had just picked up my friend, and we were driving back to my house. As we were driving by the dirt parking lot, we noticed something. The telephone company trucks were big, and you could see underneath them on the other side of one of the trucks, I saw a pair of legs and feet, like someone was just standing there motionless. The legs were very pale, standing out in the darkness. There were no shoes, just bare feet. It kind of looked like they were the legs of a child around 8 years old. As we kept driving and passed the truck, the feet and legs disappeared. We were going fast that there was no way, if it was an actual person, they could have ran off before we passed them. I asked my friend if he saw that, thinking I was crazy. And he said, "You mean the white legs and feet?" he asked. To this day, I still hope it was our imagination, playing tricks on us. And sometimes I wonder if a child may have died working in the mill many years ago, back when child labor was legal. That story is just to establish that me and this same friend can confirm with each other that we're not crazy, and we did see something otherworldly. This last event happened to me and my same friend as the ghost legs. It was late at night, and I was driving him home after coming home from the movies. Let me remind you that I live in a very rural, woodsy town. We were on this stretch of road, close to his place with woods on either side, not driving very fast. The speed limit for that road is 20 miles an hour. Just remembering this next part as I write this chills me to the absolute bone. As we're driving along, this thing flies over the road, just above the tree line. It flew next to a streetlight, which lit the creature up pretty good. At first, I just thought it was some type of bird, but as more of it appeared by the light of the streetlight, I realized this thing was way too big to be a bird of any type. The thing we saw had the body roughly the shape and size of a large wolf, but with short fur. It had bat-like wings, big enough to support its weight and size. The creature had front and back legs, unlike a bird, and also had a tail. Luckily, I didn't see it long enough to get a good description of its head, and I'm glad. I was already completely paralyzed with fear. Later on, my friend claimed that it had red eyes. The whole time this was happening, my friend and I did not say a single word. The rest of the way to his house, we said nothing. When we finally pulled his driveway, I shut off the car, and we both began freaking out. I was hoping I was going crazy, and to this day, I would think I was, but somebody saw the exact creature I did. We went on inside and told his brother he thought we were crazy, and after that long while, we told nobody because who would believe us? To this day, I don't know what kind of creature we saw that night. Just thinking about going in the woods in that town now really scares me. If anyone has any idea what we might have seen, or any strange creature stories around the New England area, I would love to hear them. Thank you. Hi, my name is Ella, and here's a story of the time that my family went over to Australia to visit family, and it ended up not being pleasant for these reasons which I will explain. I will first tell you that there's my mother Kelly, who's well in her 40s, about 5'3", and quite frightened at a lot of things. My dad Brian, who's a strong believer in the paranormal, and loves scary things. He's about 5'8", strong build. There's my sister, Alex, 20 years old. Not much to say about her, other than I personally find her annoying most of the time. It's always like a competition with her. Lastly, me, Katie, who's 15, 5'4", female, and I kind of have the same personality as my dad. Anyway, we were all so excited to be making a trip to the land down under. My parents had been saving up hard for a while to be able to go over there. My uncle lives over there with his girlfriend, and has now for about 15 years. We were ecstatic to be seeing them. My mother told me most of the plans were for when we were over there. One of them included a road trip in the outback. I'm a very paranoid person, and the thought of all the things that could possibly go wrong were making me feel ill, even though I was still very excited. Mixed emotions, I know. But the thing that scared me the most was thinking about the show Wolf Creek. For those who don't know, it's a show about a serial killer in the outback who acts friendly to people, then kills them, while trying to play a game of cat and mouse. This terrified me, and I'm sure it did to my dad too, since he also watched. It's a very gory, horrible show. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody with a weak stomach. I mean, I wish I never watched it. I'll skip forward, past all the getting over there, getting settled in and whatnot. I'll begin on the day of the road journey. It was 6 of us going all together, along with my uncle's dog, who's very gentle, and also getting quite old. The vehicle we were traveling in was an old RV, which my uncle and dad both rented, going half on the money. I was excited. I packed all my things I needed, even brought a small pocket knife, since I told you, I'm already paranoid. It was 5 a.m. We got up, and it was still dark out. It took us a good hour to get going, so we left around 6. We finally left the house, and I knew this was going to be quite the adventure. My uncle drove the RV, but my dad and him were taking turns. We had a map in case we got too lost, which of course will come in handy. Australia is a very big place, and even my uncle, who's lived there for well over 15 years now, could easily get lost. I think it took us around 2 hours to eventually enter the dry, empty desert roads. There was only a few small cars driving by, every so often, but not much people at all. I charged my MP3 player, so I just plugged in my headphones and listened to some music to try and calm my nerves. The thought of anything going possibly wrong was just too much. We stopped off a bunch of times to take in the view, get pictures of kangaroos in the distance. When I looked down the road, you could clearly see the heat rising, causing a mirage. I thought that was pretty cool. It was really hot. I'd guess if you stayed out here long enough, you could die. We got back on the road again and drove for hours and hours. I think it was around 9 p.m. when it started to get dark. It was really beautiful when it was dark. The sky was full of stars. I remember taking a few photos of them. It was fully dark now, and my dad was driving at this point. I was talking to my mother and my aunt about how beautiful it was being out here, and how this was such an experience. My aunt began telling me stories about creepy things that happen out in the desert. She's a wise person. She's the type who knows a lot of things that can't be explained. I felt safer with her out on the road. Definitely. But not gonna lie, the stories she was telling me about the unexplained things out in the desert were starting to scare me. But I didn't let her know that. I just listened in awe to her. She told me a story that I was interested in. A story about the Min Min lights. Basically, Min Min is a light phenomenon that has often been reported in the outback of Australia. Stories about the lights can be found in Aboriginal myths, predating European settlement, and have been part of a wider Australian folklore. She told me how it believed that the Min Min lights are the spirits of the dead Aborigines, whose souls lie in the outback still. It didn't make me scared. I found it more fascinating and spiritual. I sat back, tried to relax again. I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, it was 2:30 in the morning. My sister and mom were asleep, but my uncle, dad, and aunt were all awake, talking. My aunt came over to me and we're just talking about random stuff. It was nice though, as she's a good listener. We looked out the window of the RV, and it was magical outside. More stars than I have ever seen. I eventually fell back asleep on the pull-out chair, and it was not comfortable. My uncle was still driving, and my aunt and dad were asleep now too. I awoke again at 4 a.m. I don't know why I woke up so suddenly, but it felt like it was from a sound or something. My heart was beating so fast. I calmed myself down, went to reach for my water, and gulped down a lot of it. I said hello to my uncle, who was clearly exhausted from driving, and he started talking with me. I made him some coffee for his troubles of staying awake, sat back down, and just looked out the window again in awe at the mysterious wonders of the sky. Wait, what? What's that in the sky? I said in a shaky voice. He stopped the RV, parked it at the side of the road. By how shaken up I sounded, everyone else was still asleep. My uncle approached me near the window as I peered out. He took one look at what I was looking at, and his eyes widened, screaming at me to get down. He ran over to my aunt, who was asleep, to wake her up. I felt dizzy, and I was overwhelmed. I didn't know what was happening. I seen my aunt get up, seeming very confused. My uncle whispered to her, but loud enough that I could hear. "The Min lights," he said. She got up straight away, started closing the blinds. I remembered the story she told me, and that's when I actually began to feel sick and scared. I was terrified. I know this was dumb to do, but I was curious to look out the window. So I peered out, and that's when I saw it. These big balls of bright light were heading toward us from a distance. I said to my aunt, "They're not going to do us any harm, are they?" And that's when she explained to me they can, and they will. My uncle told us that we needed to get out now. He sat back in the driver's seat. There was silence, and he also exclaimed and said no. When I asked what is it, he's not really sure. He told us all that the engine would not start. I felt like crying. All my fears hit me like a brick. My aunt told me and my uncle that we all needed to go out to the back of the RV and use the spare fuel. It was safer that the three of us go. I remember fear taking over me. I don't think I was ready for this. The three of us had to do it, or else we weren't getting out of there. We all crept out into the pitch black of the outback, with only a small torch providing us with any amount of light. We crept quietly. There was a bunker underneath it where the fuel was stored. The sound of crickets stopped, and the entire outback fell into silence. My uncle told me not to look behind me, but of course I couldn't resist. When I did, I seen balls of light getting closer. I told my uncle to hurry up with putting the fuel in. He was nearly done, and my aunt was hugging me, as she knew I was scared, just as much as she was. Then I heard something behind me. I froze with a bad gut feeling. I whispered to my aunt, telling her that I had heard something. We both turned around in silence, holding our breath. I could hear my uncle's dog barking very loud in the RV. He was very much in distress, and I'm surprised my parents or sister did not wake up. I almost screamed, but my aunt stood behind me, holding my waist, and put her hand around my mouth. These two tall, lanky figures were walking toward us. They were in the dark abyss, heading toward us slowly. Humans? No. They were freakishly tall, and their bodies misshaped and weird. The Min lights had disappeared, and I wondered if these figures were the spirits of the lights. My uncle stood up, told us he was done. We didn't reply, as I guess we were both in shock. My uncle told us to get back into the RV now. I couldn't move or speak. I wanted to scream and cry, but I just stood there, staring at these figures getting closer, their eyes glowing white. Their arms were very skinny and bony, and their heads were this very strange shape. I could feel energy building up in my body, my own blood pressure rising, and I was stuck not being able to move with my eyes locked on these creatures' glowing eyes. I felt myself being dragged, and I think it was my uncle trying to get me and my aunt into the RV. We were put back inside, and he put us on the couch. I remember feeling weak and dizzy, and felt myself losing consciousness as my ears continued to ring, a very high-pitched shrill. I don't know how long I was out, but I finally got up to see my aunt still asleep, and my parents and sister now awake. We were in a small town now. It was our destination. I was confused as we were only on the road for about 11 hours, but to get to our destination, it would have taken us 3 days. My mom, sister, and father came over to me, hugged me, and asked if I was okay. I said, "Why are we already here?" My uncle said to my parents that, "Yeah, I told you she was pretty ill and was asleep for 2 days." I couldn't believe it. My mind was racing with questions. I remember hugging them and didn't argue. When we got out into the town, my uncle held me back, and I asked him one question. Was it real? He told me yes, it was, and that he could never let my parents know. All in all, it was one of the craziest, most supernatural experiences I've ever had in my life. And what those beings were, I don't know. Do I think they would have done me harm had they gotten close to me? I didn't want to find out. Who knows what hex or evil they put on me that caused me to feel dizzy, weak, and lose consciousness. I can't even imagine what they would have done to me had they gotten close to me. I'm glad I never found that out. This story is not my own, but actually from my brother, who passed away in October from COVID. He served in the military for well over 12 years before being discharged for severe medical complications that left him paralyzed until passing away this last October. He told me some wild, crazy stories about the time he served, and I thought it would be appropriate to honor his memory and tell you this crazy, terrifying story of a monster hunt out in the woods of Georgia. What was originally planned to be a survival training course that would last a week in the wilderness, with only the bare necessities, a team of 6 were chosen to participate in the training exercise. My brother being one of the first. They were given all the proper supplies and equipment needed to survive. This was also during the late spring, so they had no problems setting up traps, finding animals, surviving by whatever it is they needed to do. About 3 days into the survival training exercise, my brother's teammate was attacked by a large bear, or at least that's what they thought. My brother and the rest of his team confused at first, because to their knowledge, there are no large brown bear or grizzly bear species that inhabit the deep forest of Georgia. But this bear, was able to fully walk and stand up on 2 legs. Not just the way a bear does, where it stands up on 2 short, stubby legs and walks a short distance. This moved and operated just like a man would, in the exact same way. In fact, my brother recalled how chilling it was to actually see this thing in broad daylight, and seeing as how its legs and lower torso were just like a man. Didn't have hocks. They did not look like animal legs, exactly the way a lower man's legs look. The upper body being built like a bodybuilder and having massive biceps and triceps, with a human-like hands, full of about 4 to 5 inch claws, and a massive oversized head that was just like that of a grizzly bear. They weren't sure what it was, But this thing was a raging killing machine, killing off 2 of his teammates on that 3rd day. The rest of the 4 were left to scatter and survive, nearly forfeiting the mission. Their pickup point was going to be on day 7 at a given coordination, but since being separated by fear of this thing getting them, they were in complete disarray, and the survival mission had now become a stay alive mission, or so my brother had told me. Before I continue the story, I want to say that anybody in the military who can relate to any of this would know, when these kinds of things happen, you don't dare tell a soul, and my brother didn't. In fact, he only told me when he was on his deathbed with COVID, through a phone call, actually, telling me some other war horrors that he experienced, and that he knew he just had an innate feeling he was going to pass. Wanted to make sure that they were secrets that were aired out. This wasn't the only story he shared. There were also secrets and stories about his own life that were more personal, and he was apologizing for some of the things he did that I never even knew about. This is just so you can understand the background, that he was being honest. The man, unfortunately, died about 2 days after he told me all of this. We were pretty close, and I'm still having a very hard time processing that he's now gone. God rest his soul. Anyway, let's continue on with the story, and I'll try and hold it together the best I can while typing this out, even though it might be hard for me. This is probably therapeutic, as it helps me process those emotions and feelings. For the next 4 or 5 days, my brother would spend his time running and hiding as best he could, eating what minimal food he can find, mostly just going hungry, and only drinking what little water he could capture in his canteen. Him and his other teammate, one other of 6, ended up surviving. So ultimately 2 out of 6 survived the mission. The other 4 perished, and are believed to be eaten and devoured, torn apart by whatever this beast was. My brother never used the word werebear, but that's exactly the description that he gave me. It sounded like it was a human-like body, man, just covered in thick hair, like that of a bear, with a massive bear head. Since I'm into cryptids and monsters, I asked him a bunch of questions, since he had seen it multiple times in broad daylight. Never at nighttime, though. But he did emphasize how intelligent this creature was, that it was able to stalk, hunt, and pursue its prey. He even watched as it tore one of his teammates out of an old, unused deer stand that one of his teammates had hidden for a few days. This thing had charged at the tree, sniffed, and seemed to instinctually know he was up there, reached up into the tree stand and drug him out, ripping him in half and eating what was left. My brother was lucky enough to conceal himself by a small hole in the ground that was just very lucky to be there, and then he happened to find it. He said outrunning this thing and just keeping out of its reach was like living in a nightmare. It was like a Hollywood movie, a monster movie come to life. He has no idea what it was, what do you even call it. The only 2 people that actually made it to the coordinates on the set date was him, my brother, and one of his other teammates, like I said. They were picked up, and they told what was going on. They were also given a severe psyche evaluation, and put through much testing. From what I gathered from my brother, he was kind of vague on these next details, and I'm still not sure why, but it sounded like he said that they sent in a team to neutralize the threat, and it didn't sound like it was purposeful that creature happened to run into that team. It was not the original intent to have them survive against this thing, or so that's what I gathered. My brother, at some point during the phone call, began sobbing because he was so terrified to recall this story. I'm not kidding. This is a pretty hardy man. My brother has always been a really tough dude, taking a lot of tough situations in life very well, and never scared easily. He's always kind of been the brave older brother role all throughout my life, so to have him pass, to lose him, is a real tragedy. His story proves, like many other hunting stories, there are some creatures that are going down in the eastern United States, especially it seems like the Bible Belt, full of Bigfoot, Dogman, and whatever these wolf-bear-like creatures are, or as my brother described it, a 10-foot-tall killing machine, built like a linebacker, was easily not any normal animal. This was something beyond the realm of what we call normal. He believes, firmly believes by the way, that this thing was bioengineered. He said it was far too intelligent, far too strategic, like it knew, it plotted, waited, strategized, and used all of its senses fully, just the same way a trained killer would. And he said watching it tear apart his teammates was not only horrifying, but awe-inspiring as well, just due to the sheer intelligence. He doesn't have any first-hand experience with Bigfoot or Dogman, but does believe they exist, based on other stories that he's heard. He believes they're all bioweapons, made by the government or the military. With his untimely passing, we'll never know more details now. I guess sharing this story might be entertainment for you, but for me, it feels like emotional closure. I'm just glad that you're able to get something out of my emotional release. Thank you for being a source to come to, and that I won't be ridiculed or laughed at. I greatly appreciate all that you do. In 2008, I was hunting some buck just outside of Green River in Wyoming. I was having some pretty severe difficulties tracking a buck this day. I could see where it had bedded down the night before, and even tracks, but there was no luck. No traces of it to be found, even when following. Here's what's incredibly unsettling. During my hunt, I found some tracks intermixed between the trail where the buck tracks were. These were kind of like bear tracks, but much larger, and kind of had a human shape. There was clearly a defined arch, and the feet were much more narrow, just like that of a person. Instead of toes, it was the same toe and claw marks as you would see on a bear. I remember thinking, what on earth? It looked like a perfect mix of a huge footprint and a bear track in one, except the tracks were easily 18 and 19 inches in length, incredibly long. I took a picture I'll have to send to you. I was a little bit concerned, thinking they were just distorted tracks of a grizzly bear, since Wyoming does not only have black bears, but grizzly bears as well. You have to be on high alert. Just then, I heard something coming towards me. I look over, and this giant bear is coming hurtling at me. But there's something very wrong. This thing is not running on all fours like a bear would, or how a bear would charge at you. It was running on two legs, the same way that an athletic runner would. It was even leaned over just like a person, using its arms going back and forth, with its hands straightened down in front of it, as if it were sprinting right at me. I almost crapped my pants right where I stood. My brain could simply not process what it was I was looking at. This creature, this animal was humongous, and it appeared to be half man, half bear. As ridiculous as this sounds, that's clearly what it looked like. And it was charging, barreling at me at insane speeds. I had no choice other than to throw my rifle down and run. I can't even tell you how fast I ran. And after maybe a minute or so, I turned around. It wasn't running after me anymore. I have no idea where it went, or what it was doing. The area in which I was hunting is pretty open, so I have no idea where it could have hid, or where it could have crouched down. Bears are very large animals, and it's very unlike them to just bluff charge you, and then to just disappear all of a sudden. I was frightened, but very confused. I slowly and stealthily made my way back to pick my rifle up at the spot I was. I had probably ran 300 yards. Once I got back to my rifle, I looked around. I didn't see anything. Thinking I was just seeing anything, I was left with a lingering feeling, very ominous, like I was being closely watched, and that I needed to leave. I trusted my gut instinct, and I left out of there quickly. Look, I know my story sounds ridiculous, ludicrous, and not believable, which I hope you can understand. This is why I've been very hesitant to even share my story for a long time. I mean, who's going to believe me? But the more I hear about these half-human, half-bear, or half-human, half-dog animals, the more I feel a little bit more comfortable to share my own personal experiences. I'm not sitting here claiming to know what it is that I saw, or what it is that came in and tried to attack me, but I can thoroughly stand by my experience. It has left me with a little bit of trauma, I'm not going to lie, and definitely teaches me to be humble and to respect what's out there in the wild. Do I believe it was just a grizzly bear? No, I don't. It looked far too different. Its proportions, the way its body was, its size, it was all wrong. If you jump on YouTube and watch how a grizzly bear runs, it's very specific, very distinct. This creature, whatever it was, did not run like that. It was much more human in nature, and it was larger, if that's even believable. I understand that's disturbing, and it might even be hard to swallow, but I believe there's creatures and animals that live out there that we don't always even know about.